It's Tongo night at Quark's, a Ferengi game that involves cards, other cards, a spinny thing, and a not insignificant amount of money. The session isn't open to the public, though Dax has managed to wangle herself a seat and is doing a fair job at winning everything. That's an affront to Rom, what with her being a female and all, so learning that the game was picked up by Dax's former male host, Curzon, helps soften the blow, even if she is a far better player than he ever was. The unknown face at the table is another Ferengi, and he's got lines too, so let's slap a name on him. The wheel decrees that our unknown Ferengi will henceforth be remembered as... Wheelie McNameface, provided by Ensign One Who Hopes. Wheelie McNameface is trying to prompt Rom into talking to Quark, without much luck. Ferengi make their own luck though, so Wheelie just talks to Quark himself. He's got a business idea, a bean to make customers more thirsty so they buy more drinks. Quark tries one and immediately takes a drink without even realizing it. He's suitably impressed, and more so when Wheelie shows extensive knowledge of the rules of acquisition, all to the displeasure of Rom. That'll have to wait as Quark's getting a call. It's Grand Nagus Zek, leader of the Ferengi Alliance, and he's smiling, which probably means Quark's in danger. The last visit nearly saw Quark getting farted out of an airlock by his own brother. Odd then that Quark doesn't smell something dodgy when Grand Nagus Zek tells him that he wants Quark to be his chief negotiator for upcoming Gamma Quadrant trade talks. Despite having appointed someone else to do the job, Zek's come to Deep Space Nine himself. He wants negotiations with the race from the Gamma Quadrant to be held here on the station, possibly so they associate the deal with us rather than the Ferengi, when things inevitably go tits up. Kira's not chuffed at the idea and isn't feeling very diplomatic about it, so Zek bribes her. It's couched as a gift, of course, and even then he has to be blackmailed by Cisco into not charging for it, but it does the job, so Zek will get his conference. Or should that be Quark's conference, as he's still doing the actual talking? Zek wants Tula berries. More specifically, he wants the wine, as he thinks monopolizing the Tula berry wine market is how the Ferengi will firmly establish themselves in Gamma Quadrant commerce. All Quark has to do is buy an ungodly amount of the stuff. It's Wheelie McNameface who tells Quark that the clinking of latinum he's hearing might actually be the sound of Zek sharpening his dagger. It's lucrative all right, but if the flagship Ferengi Gamma Quadrant deal goes down the pan, having someone else perform the actual negotiations will make for a handy scapegoat. Quark sees the logic in what Wheelie's saying and the value of someone who noticed it in the first place. Some swift negotiating on percentages results in Wheelie McNameface becoming Quark's assistant, all while Rom seethes at this upstart taking the place he thinks is rightfully his. If this all ends up in an airlock again, maybe Quark will have company. Or maybe it won't get that far. Wheelie McNameface returns to his quarters and, withdrawing a box from under his bed, takes a tool from it. The space is filled by prosthetic earlobes, and we see Wheelie's normal ears are the smaller kind usually seen on Ferengi females. Our Gamma Quadrant guests have arrived, and our first experience of them is violence. One bounces off a wall, thrown by a guy who describes it as a minor disagreement. Zek choosing to delegate negotiations may have been as much for his safety as his reputation. Some talking later and they're close to a deal, but the current offer is for half of what Quark needs. They want to talk to Grand Nagus Zek directly, and Quark starting to fumble at their increased aggression. It's Wheelie McNameface who saves the day and says it's Quark or nobody, bluntness apparently being the right tactic for dealing with these people. There's no agreement, but at least they're still talking. To Ops we go, and we see once again that the control centre of the entire station has an open door policy for any bugger who just wanders in. It's Tall Lad this time, Grand Nagus Zek's personal assistant, and he's bringing Kira a gift. Zek's taken a shine to her, it seems, and thinks a latinum earring is the way to express himself. Given the Ferengi attitude towards money, I suppose you could argue this makes it sincere. Kira's not interested in either the gift or the sender, and is confused by Dax's attitude towards the Ferengi in general. Dax explains it's because, if you accept them on their own terms, they're actually great fun. I mean, okay, those terms are lying, thieving, and turning misogyny into an art form, but at least they're consistent about it. Quark's has closed for the night, and that means it's time for another game of Cardi Spin Cash! There are a few more players this time, including Grand Nagus Zek himself. Dax is still winning though, which must be more than a little embarrassing for the guy who's supposed to be the best business leader in the galaxy. He gets a bit pissy about losing and tries to cheat, something Dax has no time for. With that ruled out, he takes his frustration out on everybody else, mainly Quark, for playing games instead of thinking about negotiations. That might also be why Zek now says he wants 10 times the quantity of wine that Quark was originally tasked with getting. Quark's thrown by this, so again, Wheelie McNameface steps in to take over and showers Zek with praise, saying such an increase would show them we're serious about our ambitions for the Gamma Quadrant. Quark goes to get more snacks at Zek's prompting, and Wheelie follows him. Quark's concerned about how things are going, so Wheelie smooths this over too and says he'll manage it. The kindness confuses Quark until he's reminded about the 20% commission Wheelie will be taking if they pull this off. A look from Dax when they return to the table suggests she thinks Wheelie's motivations might not be quite that simple. Dax joins Wheelie McNameface at the Replimat later. Conversation turns to Quark when Wheelie mentions that he talks about Dax a lot, and that gives Dax a chance to expertly probe Wheelie's feelings on the topic. Wheelie's surprised when Dax says she's seen the way Wheelie looks at Quark, but not as surprised as Dax is when Wheelie says she's a woman. Dax has never met a Ferengi woman before, which is hardly surprising when their culture dictates they shouldn't leave the house, or learn to read, or wear clothes. Wheelie decided she wasn't up for that shit though and just chose to ignore it. Some false lobes later and here she is hunting for profit with nobody the wiser. It was all going so well till she fell for Quark. Now it's complicated. Dax's advice to chase more than latinum is cut off by the arrival of Quark himself. The negotiations are restarting and he needs the one person who stopped it from turning nasty last time. Grand Nagus Zek's on the upper promenade admiring the views when Kira finds him and returns his gift. He tries to see if a night of sexy times is on the cards anyway because he's a dirty little bastard, but he'll have to settle for a holosuite wank instead. The bad news keeps on coming. Quark's here to report on the negotiations, or more accurately, the collapse of them. The other party was so offended that they buggered off back home when Quark asked for 10 times the amount originally requested. Zek's berating Quark when Wheelie, again, comes to the rescue. We'll just follow them home and keep trying till they agree. Here's hoping they see that as an indication of how serious we are rather than, stalking. They'll need Zek's ship, of course, but it's that or failure, so he agrees. At least he can say he gave Quark every chance for success if it comes to blaming him later on. The journey gives them time for a chat, during which they discuss why Zek would try to change the terms of the negotiation while it was in progress. Sounds dodgy, but neither of them understand why. A rare, genuine compliment from Quark about Wheelie, not one driven by profit like the kind he showers on guests, makes her try to reveal her secret to him. He thinks it's an attempt to get a higher percentage, though, and cuts her off before she begins, so the opportunity is lost. Time to break the news herself might be running out. Rom's run off his feet working the bar while Quark is gone, but still misses him despite the exploitation and is jealous that Wheelie McNameface is the one getting his attention. An arguably misconstrued comment from Odo makes Rom decide to take matters into his own hands. That's why he's broken into Wheelie's quarters to search for something incriminating and finds the makeup box with a pair of spare false earlobes in. Quark and Wheelie are at a gathering of some sort. What looks like a knees-up is actually a kind of business meeting, only with more drinking, violence, and dead people. The guy who told Quark to stick his deal up his arse is there too, though isn't feeling particularly talkative despite Quark's persistence. Quark's been watching the others and thinks he understands how to get attention, which is why he tosses a vat of wine into the middle of the floor. Surprisingly, it works. Well, sort of, as he gets an agreement for the original deal of 10,000 vats. That was before Zek decided to interfere, though, and make it significantly more. The guy calls that impossible, despite Quark saying he's not leaving till he gets it, so I guess we're staying the night. Slight problem, there's only one bed. Quark doesn't want to go back to the ship in case an opportunity arises, and this is clearly not an ideal arrangement for Wheelie McNameface. Trying to stall him with drinks is a bit of a mixed bag, what with her kissing him and all. He's a little taken aback and ends up on the bed with her on top, trying to explain. Naturally, this is when somebody else comes in, specifically the other visitor to our station from earlier. Once we get the sitcom awkwardness and denials out of the way, she explains why Quark is never going to get his 100,000 vats of wine. Put simply, because the guy he's negotiating with doesn't have it. Nobody does, at least not on this planet. For that, he'll have to talk to people called the Karama, who are quite important in a Gamma Quadrant organization known as the Dominion. A journey home where Quark outright refuses to discuss or even acknowledge certain bedroom events with Wheelie McNameface means they've got time to talk about other things. At least they figured out why Zek deliberately sabotaged things now. It was never about the wine, it was about asking for enough business that they'd need to be passed up the supply chain to someone bigger. And that knowledge is why Quark isn't so bothered about Zek's little performance at his failure when he gets back. He knows what Zek actually wants, and after enough dancing around to bag a percentage of all future deals, Quark passes on the name. Perhaps learning he's rich makes him more inclined to listen to his brother, who's been trying to get his attention during the entire talk with Zek. Rom has some news for him about Wheelie McNameface, and it's fair to say Quark is a little surprised to hear it. He wakes up in the infirmary. Getting rid of Bashir is easy enough, and that gives him the space to make sure Rom hasn't told anybody about his discovery. Not yet, we learn, but he plans to change that. Women wearing clothes and making money? Whatever next? Of course, if Zek finds out, then Quark will be a laughingstock and shunned by other Ferengi. Rom's insistence that Zek should be told anyway lasts until he's offered the bar, at which point he decides maybe there's no need for a fuss after all. The only person who can scupper the whole thing now is Wheelie herself, which is why Quark visits. He's concerned about her current lack of lobes and other potential clues, telling her to get ready and pack. Being here is too dangerous for them both, so he's sending her away. He's even giving her some latinum to start over. She appeals to his affections, and he doesn't deny having them, but he says it simply can't work. She'd never be happy with abiding by Ferengi tradition, and he can't get past a lifetime of taboos to be comfortable with anything else, even if they started again in the Gamma Quadrant like she suggests. There really is only one way this ends, and it's like most Star Trek romances. Badly. A celebration meal is being enjoyed by everybody except Quark, who doesn't have much of an appetite. It's not helped when Wheelie McNameface decides to visit and bid the Grand Nagus farewell. Zek's pleased to see her and compliments her skills, saying she has a bright future. He's not quite as complimentary when she takes off her false lobes and tosses them at him, the discovery that she's a female affecting his appetite somewhat too. Rom is thrown out when the argument starts, more upset now about losing the bar than social taboos. Zek tries to lay into Quark and Wheelie steps in to defend him, something which just makes Zek more angry. Threats of her being thrown into prison forever get Quark involved. Zek tries to shut him down by reminding Quark that taking business advice from a woman is against the law. The problem for Zek is that's a sword which cuts both ways, as he sent Wheelie McNameface to negotiate on his behalf. Zek sees the point and agrees to keep everything quiet. All it'll cost Quark is the commission from those Gamma Quadrant deals. Once Zek's gone, Wheelie apologizes for what she did and says it was important for Zek to learn women can be every bit as money-hungry as men. She'll be leaving shortly, again asking Quark to come with her, even though they both know it won't happen. They mash faces as she leaves, and she proves she'd have made the perfect partner by asking for the latinum he offered her before. He's back to being the upbeat barkeep of old when he invites Dax for another game of Cardi Spin Cash later. She knows it's a mask, despite his protestations, and we leave him to consider what his culture might have cost him, until the next adventure. Another Ferengi comedy episode and another little dive into Ferengi culture. This one is about them being turbo-misogynists, and obviously that's a terrible thing from our perspective, but it does raise the more interesting question of whether we're right to consider it as such. Before you start furiously typing, I'm not talking about us humans, I'm talking about Ferengi. See, the episode raises an unintentional dilemma. Starfleet operates on the principle of non-interference, so is this episode's moral at odds with that? Does the viewer condemning how Wheelie McNameface is treated run contrary to the very core essence of Trek? If you want to take things to the extreme, you could even argue that Dax giving advice to Wheelie McNameface technically qualifies as a Prime Directive violation, as she's interfering in Ferengi societal development by interacting with somebody deemed verboten by their government. You'd struggle to get even the most severe of admirals to hand out a punishment for that, but it's accurate when following the strict letter of the rule. Yet another example of how unthinking adherence to Starfleet's flagship policy is essentially unworkable and, on occasion, runs at a direct tangent to the story itself. With our semi-regular, semi-mocking of the Prime Directive out of the way, of course Wheelie McNameface is right to be doing what she's doing. There are all the reasons we know for that being true, but it has a more curious twist here. Ignoring a sizable chunk of your population, assuming a similar spread to humans, isn't just wrong. It's the worst offence a Ferengi can commit. It's unprofitable. Giving Ferengi women the same rights as men would drastically increase earning potential for the entire Ferengi alliance, and the stated goal of a people being held back by taboos is something we've seen before. If you've been here since our Voyager days, you might remember it's an argument I made against Tuvok. His distaste for the overtly emotional actions of Neelix is, ironically, an emotional response in itself. Pure logic would be to accept Neelix's strengths and not allow cultural taboos against emotion to colour that. The Ferengi stated goal of pure profit is being hampered here by their own cultural taboos, something that's stopping them from potentially doubling their income. And that leads us to another abstract question. Are these examples of species holding themselves back through inhibition an intentional nod to ourselves, or just something that has seeped through into the scripts unconsciously? Let's move on. Another topic of interest is that this episode might be the closest Trek had come at this point to overtly referencing homosexuality. When Dax is talking to Wheelie about loving Quark, the existence of that affection creates no surprise in her despite the assumed gender, that response only coming when Dax learns the relationship would be heterosexual. That the whole thing is played for comedy is hardly the best example of representation, but something is better than nothing, especially in a show that has regularly fought against such things, despite Roddenberry himself saying he wanted to change that before his death. We've had the Outcast in TNG making covert nods to LGBT stuff, of course, but that was deliberately wrapped in so much cotton wool that it could bounce off anybody who didn't want to see it. I'm not the only person to think old Trek's lack of queer representation is one of its most glaring flaws for such an objectively progressive show. We know now that's something many of the writers and actors wanted to change, only to face resistance from those with the power to actually do it. Come to think of it, maybe that ties into what we were talking about a moment ago, with potential being limited by ingrained bias. Lastly is something a bit more mundane. If you saw the lead alien guy and thought he looked familiar, that's because Brian Thompson has had his fingers in more science fiction pies than Neelix. These are just the ones that I recognised from his IMDb page, though a deeper dive would likely show more. That got me thinking of other guest appearances in the show and the different faces we might know without necessarily knowing that we know them. There's probably a video in that somewhere, a look into the actors who are instantly recognisable without achieving what you'd call star status. It's certainly a phenomenon we see regularly enough in Trek to be on brand, so stick any you can think of in the comments, and maybe that might make for a fun little side project. End of episode.
I told you not to get your hopes up.
Miserable git, it were an accident. It's not like I wanted to take a jump on his dangus, is it?
Come on, buddy. We expected this result.
I spent ages writing that letter. Had to get Odo to tape a pen onto me paw. You'd think the effort would count for something.
To be fair, you didn't really need the illustrations.
Art is supposed to soothe the savage beast.
I'm pretty sure that's music.
Oh. You don't think it...
We are not going to write a song about you biting his dick.
All right, it were just a thought. Woof.